All right, so get ready, because today we're diving into a case that is truly, well, bizarres is probably the best word for it.
Yeah, definitely bizarre.
We're looking into the disappearance of Rudolph RP,
Rudolph RP.
a German farmer who vanished, disappeared in 2001,
2001.
only to reappear years later in the most, well, unexpected way imaginable, I guess you could say,
This unexpected way.
at the bottom of a river,
Yeah.
inside his car.
Inside his car. Yep.
It's a wild one.
Yeah, this is not your typical missing person story, This one, it's got it all. Conflicting confessions, family secrets, legal challenges. Really puts the whole system to the test.
Yeah, and like we do in our deep dives, we're basing this one on a true crime podcast episode that really goes deep on the investigation.
And trust me, it's a wild ride. You won't believe the twists and turns this case takes.
So to set the scene a bit, give the listeners a little background. Rudolph was 52 years old, lived on a farm with his wife and two daughters, and was known for frequenting the local, what was it called?
The BSV No-Board Clubhouse.
Yeah, that's it. The BSV No Board Clubhouse. I guess you could kind of think of it like a community center where people in the area would gather.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And it seems like Rudolph's thing, well, one of his things anyway, was enjoying a few beers there.
A few beers, yeah. Apparently, Rudolph wasn't exactly Mr. Congeniality at the clubhouse.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, the podcast paints him as kind of, argumentative. After a few drinks, especially. Maybe even a bit of a bully, if you can believe some of the accounts.
Oh, wow. I didn't get that from the description I read.
And there's this detail, kind of a funny one, about him always insisting on wearing his dirty overalls to the clubhouse.
Dirty overall.
Like straight from the farm, yeah? You can imagine that didn't exactly make him the most popular guy,
Yeah, I can imagine that might not have gone over so well. Not the best way to make friends and influence people.
Right. The podcast mentions people would kind of steer clear, not just because of the aroma, but also because of that personality.
So picture this. It's October 12th, 2001, late at night. Rudolph's finishing up his usual routine at the clubhouse. The owner even offered him a ride home, but Rudolph insisted he was fine to drive.
And this is key here, because Rudolph, he drove a Mercedes. A car he absolutely treasured.
Ready.
Oh yeah, this car was his pride and joy. It's actually a crucial detail in the case, so keep that in mind.
Okay, got it. A Mercedes, eh? I wonder what model.
Not sure about the model, but it was his prized possession, that's for sure. Anyway, he leaves the clubhouse in his Mercedes, and that's the last anyone sees of him. For a long, long time.
Vanishes into thin air. Poof.
Pretty much.
So what happened next?
Well, the next day, his wife, Hermina, reported him missing.
Makes sense. Missing husband, you call the cops, right?
Right. And naturally, they start looking into it. They consider the usual things, right? Drunk driving accident, maybe suicide.
Yeah, those seem like the most likely scenarios in this situation.
But there's a huge problem, a glaring issue, really. There's no car, no body, no trace of Rudolph anywhere. Like, he just vanished completely.
That's strange.
Yeah.
So, no car crash.
Nope. And that's where that Mercedes detail comes in. See, Rudolph was so attached to that car, it doesn't really fit with the suicide theory, Why would he abandon his beloved Mercedes?
It doesn't make sense.
And that's not all. You also have to factor in the whole family dynamic here.
What do you mean?
Well, the podcast portrays the RP household as kind of, troubled. There were financial strains, a strained marriage, and they had 2 teenage daughters, both with special needs.
Oh, wow.
Even a tenant who lived on their property at the time described their home environment as, quote, antisocial.
Antisocial, huh?
Yeah, not exactly a picture of domestic bliss.
So given all that, I imagine the rumor mill started churning pretty quickly.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The locals started whispering about the family's possible involvement. It was almost like one of those dark fairy tales, The grumpy farmer disappears and everyone's looking suspiciously at his family.
So were they suspects right from the start?
Initially, the police kind of dismissed those rumors about the family. They were more focused on the accident or suicide angle. But trust me, that's just the tip of the iceberg in this story.
So where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this bizarre saga?
Well, that's where things take a sharp turn. 2 years pass, and then in 2003, a new prosecutor decides to take a fresh look at this cold case.
A fresh set of eyes.
Exactly. They weren't convinced by the accident or suicide theories. They sensed something was off, especially with the family's stories about that night.
And what happens? What do they find?
Well, their instincts were right on the money. The podcast details how, under the pressure of this new investigation, the family starts to crack. Hermina, Rudolph's wife, she confesses that he actually did come home that night.
Oh.
Yeah. They argued, he fell down the stairs, and she, along with others, got rid of the body.
Wait, hold on. So he did come home that night, but she initially said,
It's a shocking admission, right? But get this, it gets even more complicated. Rudolph's daughter, Andrea, drops a bombshell. She alleges years of sexual abuse by her father.
whoa, now that changes things.
It does. It adds fuel to the fire, right? Makes the theory of a family cover-up seem even more plausible. You have a potential motive now.
So you've got these confessions. Seems like case closed, right?
You'd think so. But here's the catch, and it's a big one.
I'm listening.
There is absolutely zero forensic evidence to support any of it. No blood, no DNA, nothing to back up the story of a violent death.
No physical evidence whatsoever.
None. And that's where things get really, really tricky. Without that physical evidence, the entire case hinges on the reliability of those confessions. And as we'll see, that's a dangerous game to play.
So we're left with these shocking confessions, but without a shred of physical evidence to back them up. Where does the case go from there?
That's when it all starts to, well, unravel, I guess is the best way to put it. The podcast describes how each family member, each of them, starts changing their story. And each version they give becomes more outlandish than the last.
More outlandish. How so?
I mean, we're talking dismemberment, feeding body parts to dogs. It's crazy. Just a chaotic mess of contradictory statements. And the police are left trying to make sense of it all, just bewildered.
Wow. So they could keep their stories straight. That's not a good look for them.
Not at all. And there's this one detail. It really sticks out from the daughter's fiance, Matthias.
Matthias.
Yeah, he gives this incredibly graphic description of dismembering the body, even boiling the skull. Really gruesome stuff.
Oh, man. That's disturbing.
But here's the thing. Even with all these gory details he's throwing around, there's still absolutely no physical evidence to support any of it.
So it's just a story. No proof.
Exactly. And to make matters even more complicated, by 2004, every single person involved recants their confession. They all claim they were coerced by the police. Yeah. They say they were pressured, intimidated into confessing.
So they're saying they didn't do it after admitting they...
Right. And it creates this huge legal problem because the trial, it moves forward based on these retracted statements.
Wait, so they're going to trial using confessions that everyone is now saying are false.
It's a fascinating legal situation for sure. You've got these confessions, they're like the foundation of the whole case, and then suddenly everyone involved is saying, nope, we made it all up. So the prosecution, they have to get a little creative.
Creative.
Yeah, they basically try to stitch together a story from the bits and pieces of these various confessions, despite all the contradictions. And to add to that, they even bring in this pathologist who suggests that the lack of blood, well, it's not totally implausible depending on how Rudolph died.
So they're building this whole case around a story that keeps changing with no physical proof at all. Doesn't seem like a very strong case, to be honest.
It wasn't. But the defense had their own challenges, too. They pointed to the low IQs of the accused, the possibility of mental illness, and the fact that none of them had lawyers during those initial interrogations, those crucial first interviews. Their argument was that these people were vulnerable and pressured into saying whatever the police wanted to hear.
Makes sense. I mean, if you're under that kind of pressure, especially if you're already in a tough spot, it's easy to imagine how you might confess to something you didn't do just to make it stop.
Right. And this case really highlights how unreliable coerced confessions can be. People under pressure, especially vulnerable people, they might say anything to get out of a bad situation. And that's what happened here.
It's like the ultimate he said, she said situation, but with life-altering consequences. And then you add in that lack of physical evidence, and it just creates this cloud of uncertainty over the whole thing. So what happened? Did they actually get convicted based on these questionable confessions?
Unfortunately, yes. Despite the defense's arguments, the court found all four guilty of manslaughter. The daughters, they were convicted as accessories. But the whole verdict, it rested entirely on those retracted confessions.
Manslaughter. What does that even mean in this context?
That's a good question. Manslaughter in this case basically means they were found responsible for his death, but they didn't necessarily set out to kill him. It acknowledges that his death was a result of their actions, but not that it was premeditated murder.
So it's like they contributed to his death somehow, but didn't plan to kill him.
Exactly. But, as we'll see, even that verdict is going to become problematic.
So the family's in jail, convicted based on their confessions that they've now taken back. Seems like that's the end of the story, right? But that would be too easy for this case, wouldn't it?
Oh, you know it. Remember how Rudolph's Mercedes, that car he loved so much, it vanished with him?
Yeah. I remember.
Well, in 2009, a routine sonar scan of the Danube River, totally by chance, makes an incredible discovery. Two cars submerged at the bottom. And you guessed it, one of them is Rudolph's Mercedes.
What are the odds? They find his car after all these years just by chance. Amazing.
Truly a twist of fate. They pull the car out of the river, and inside they find Rudolph's body. Amazingly, it was mostly intact, thanks to the cold water. But here's the real kicker. There were absolutely no signs of violence on the body. No head injuries, no dismemberment, nothing that matched those gruesome confessions.
Hold on. All those vivid details, those confessions, and yet his body shows no evidence of any of it. This changes everything.
It does. And to make things even more confusing, the autopsy couldn't even determine for sure how Rudolph died. Was he dead before he went into the river? Did he drown? It's a question that remains unanswered. But one thing is clear. Those confessions were completely made up.
Wow. So much for case closed. This just got a whole lot more complicated. So they find Rudolph's body years later, and it basically throws those confessions, those detailed confessions that put his family behind bars, right out the window. What happened next? I can only imagine the public was, well, outraged is probably an understatement.
You're right, it was huge, this massive public outcry, people demanding Hermina's immediate release, retrials for everyone involved. I mean, the case became a national sensation, really sparked these debates about, how much can we trust confessions, the whole potential for wrongful convictions. It was a big deal.
Yeah, it is a scary thought, right? That someone could be found guilty, imprisoned, based on a confession that's later proven false. What did the justice system do to try and fix this?
Well, initially it wasn't easy. There were some roadblocks, you could say. The judge actually denied a retrial at first.
He denied a retrial. Why?
His reasoning was that the manner of Rudolph's death, it didn't change the fact that, legally speaking, a homicide had occurred.
Hold on, but the guy drowned in his car? How can they still call it a homicide?
Right. It raises this fascinating legal question. Can someone be guilty of a crime if they confess to doing it in a way that didn't actually happen? In this case, the judge initially said yes.
Wow. I don't even know what to say to that. It doesn't feel right.
It does make you think, right? I mean, legally maybe, but morally it feels very wrong. But thankfully, a higher court stepped in. They saw things differently and granted a retrial for the family.
Okay, so there's hope. A retrial.
Yeah, but there were some conditions.
Yeah.
Because they'd already served their sentences, no more prison time was possible. So this retrial, it focused on clearing their names, not punishment.
So the goalposts had shifted. It wasn't about did they do it anymore, but about righting a wrong, I guess you could say. How did everyone approach this new trial? Did they change their strategies?
Definitely. The prosecution, they had to totally rethink things. I mean, they couldn't use the old story anymore, so they came up with this new idea that maybe Rudolph had been beaten unconscious, before being put in the river. They downplayed the daughter's involvement, focused more on Hermina and Matthias.
So they were still saying it was homicide, but kind of adapting the story to fit the new, or I guess, lack of evidence.
Yeah.
What about the defense? Did they change things up too?
They actually stuck with their original strategy, but they doubled down, highlighted all the flaws in that initial investigation, the leading questions, the unrecorded interrogations, the inconsistencies from witnesses, all of it. They basically argued that all this created this pressure cooker environment for the family, these vulnerable people, and it led to those false confessions.
It's a good reminder that the justice system, which we think of as this beacon of fairness and truth, it can make mistakes too. And those mistakes have real consequences, big consequences.
Absolutely. This case is a perfect example of that, how easily things can go wrong, especially when you're dealing with coerced confessions. It highlights how important due process is, the right to a lawyer, thorough investigations, all of it. Without those things, you end up with situations like this.
So after all these years, all these legal battles, what was the final outcome? What happened to the family?
In 2011, all four were acquitted. They finally cleared their names. But, and this is a big but, they were denied compensation for their wrongful imprisonment. The judge, even though he admitted there were errors made, he still defended the initial legal process.
That's unbelievable. They spend years in jail for a crime they didn't commit, all because of these faulty confessions. And they get nothing. No apology, no recognition of the injustice.
It's a tough pill to swallow, for sure. A bittersweet victory, as they say, free, with their names cleared, but still carrying the burden of all those years lost. And the system that failed them offered no real justice.
So where does that leave us? Rudolph's case, it's this tangled web of unanswered questions. How did he die? Accident? Suicide? Was it something more sinister, something that just didn't leave any trace? And what about the family? What was their role in all of this? We may never know the full truth.
And that's what makes this case so compelling, right? Does the lack of a clear answer make it more intriguing or less? Does the truth always bring closure? Or can we find some kind of peace even when we don't know everything?
This deep dive, it's forced us to look at the justice system, how confessions can be so powerful, so misleading, and how even the systems we trust can be flawed. It's a reminder that the search for justice, it's not always simple, and sometimes the truth, well, it stays hidden no matter how hard we look. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
As always, it's been a pleasure.